Hey guys, this is Christiana, Education Director at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, and I'm coming to you live from our new exhibit, Looking Like the Enemy, the Internment of the Issei at Fort Missoula. And we're coming to you today as part of the Day of Remembrance, which is the anniversary of Executive Order 9066. So it's a special day to remember what happened to over 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II. Those of you who are familiar with Fort Missoula know that our folks that ended up here, our detainees, got here because of a different law, and I'll get into that. But 9066 is still significant in the history of the Japanese folks that were here because their family members oftentimes were removed from the West Coast due to 9066. I've been doing tours all day, so my talking's a little bit discombobulated, so you'll have to bear with me. But if you have questions while I'm talking, feel free to post them in the comments, and I'll either get back to you live while we're doing this, or I'll get back to you later. I also don't know how long my phone battery is gonna survive, so I don't think you're getting the full 45-minute tour. That being said, I should mention I am more than happy to give tours to individuals or to folks who are family members, or even just to set up for one person at a time. I'd be happy to let you into the museum. We should open again at some point, but in the meantime, we'd love to have folks out to visit this exhibit. So I'm going to flip this around so you can see where we are. There's our entry panel there. This is in our Heath Gallery. And we also do have a virtual exhibit so that you can go through and look at each of these panels. So today we won't go through each of these panels, but as soon as we get that updated with some new material, I will make sure that that's linked here. So one of the things that's special about this exhibit is that it takes into account the whole long-lasting tradition of the laws that made it difficult to be an Asian American immigrant, and that really set the scene for the kinds of discrimination and the internment and forced removal of all of these Japanese American folks. These panels you'll be able to see them when I give you the virtual exhibit, but for now I'm going to flip this around and tell you some of the more interesting points. Okay, so over here we have a section about the Naturalization Act. So what this is about is how the government decided who could become a citizen. So way back in 1790, the government decided that you could become a citizen of the United States if you were a free white person, or you lived in the United States for 2 years, and you were a person of good character. So immediately that excluded indigenous people, black people, indentured or enslaved people, and then as we expanded west and became a place where Asian Americans or Asian people immigrated, they also couldn't become naturalized citizens. The other law that's important here is John Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts, which the only one that lasted was the Alien Enemies Act. So today we're going to be talking a lot about the Alien Enemies Act, which is how the FBI were able to send people to Fort Missoula, and we're going to be talking about Executive Order 9066. So the Alien Enemies Act still exists today, and it provided that the United States government could arrest and deport aliens from a hostile nation. So that's going to be really important when Fort Missoula was established. So we have some laws that make it difficult to become a citizen, and then we have some difficulties in immigration. So probably folks have heard about when the railroads were being built and the gold rush, and how that was a time when a lot of Chinese folks immigrated to the United States. As we see in a lot of different stories of immigration, a lot of times immigrants move in, they work the jobs that people don't want, and then they also kind of get blamed for things when stuff goes wrong. So what we have here is, first it was the Chinese, and then I'm going to have to check my dates here, We have the the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was 1882, which made it so that Chinese folks couldn't immigrate to the United States. But that meant that there were still lots of jobs that they had been doing that they needed to recruit immigrants. So that became the perfect time to recruit Japanese immigrants. There's a lot of interesting history that I'm not going to dive in here because I told you I wasn't going to take 45 minutes. But Japanese immigrants were able to come into the United States, and they did settle and work in places like the railroads, but then also starting businesses on the West Coast and orchards and all kinds of cool things until 1924, which was when the Immigration Act of 1924 came about. And that was a result of a lot of movements towards the exclusion of Japanese folks in California and other states. But what it meant in 1924 is that you couldn't come from Japan to immigrate into the United States legally, and if you were a Japanese citizen, you couldn't hold land. Now, people found ways to get around that by having their naturally born citizens own the land, but we'll get into that later. Just to better understand the racism of the times, I'm going to read to you a quote that's on this. So it says, and this is a quote from J.S. McClatchy, who was part of the Japanese Exclusion League of 1920. The Japanese possess superior advantages in economic competition, partly because of racial characteristics, thrift, industry, low standards of living, willingness to work long hours without expensive pleasures, the women working as men, etc. Combined with these characteristics, extraordinary cooperation and solidarity, and the assistance of the Japanese government through associations acting for it on its behalf, and the Japanese concentrating in communities and industry are easily able to supplant the whites. So there was definitely a lot of fear of Japanese folks taking over the western United States, and you see a lot of states put into their own state laws different tactics that made it difficult to live and work in California and other states if you were Japanese at that time. So why is this important? Well, if we move over to the 1930s, we see sort of continued racist policies towards Japanese folks that are living in the United States, including in the 1930s, you guys might recognize this artist here. This is a political cartoon written by Dr. Seuss, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but just kind of keep that in your mind. In 1936, we have Europe as things are simmering. Actually, things are more than simmering in Europe, and the U.S. government starting to think that we're probably going to end up in war, or at war, and probably Japan's going to be part of that too. So we have this quote from Franklin Roosevelt, and he says, "One obvious thought occurs to me that every Japanese citizen or non-citizen on the island of Oahu who meets these Japanese ships or has any connection with their officers or men should be secretly but definitely identified and his or her name placed on a special list of those who would be the first to be placed in a concentration camp in the event of trouble." So what does that mean? Why would a Japanese person living in Oahu go to meet a Japanese ship? So there's lots of different reasons. Imagine that you were, say, a prominent Irish person living in Boston. If an Irish delegation came from Ireland, there would be people who would be sent out to go meet them, have tea with them, whatever. It was basically the same thing here. There might be reasons why a representative from the Japanese community might be interested in meeting with someone who'd come on a ship to Oahu. So nothing sinister there, but it was enough to get you on Roosevelt's list. So we had some definite sort of fear going on there, but Roosevelt decides that there needs to be a report to figure out if all of these Japanese Americans on the West Coast are going to be an issue. And so Mr. Munson, Curtis Munson, was a businessman who'd been an intelligence person for the government in Martinique. And so his job was to go to California and to spend a bunch of time interviewing folks that were naval officers there, but then also with talking to the Japanese American community on the West Coast to decide whether or not they were potentially a threat. And what's interesting is that his overall thoughts were that although there were going to be some folks who would be, you know, crackpot enthusiasts and they might do some sabotage, that it would really only be 50 to 60 in each district who could be dangerous, and that would be easy enough for the FBI to manage and to keep an eye on. So he was definitely more worried about communists and that sort of element than he was worried about Japanese Americans and Japanese folks living on the West Coast. He even said that they exhibited an extraordinary degree of loyalty to the United States. So how did we go from this report from Munson to a series of war relocation authority camps and 120,000 people being taken off the West Coast? Well, unfortunately, what FDR received was the full report, which was probably thick, but then also a one-page summary. And the one-page summary emphasized the few threats that Munson mentioned. So what FDR took away from that was more that there would be danger from the Japanese American community on the West Coast. So moving right along, this is where we get to Fort Missoula. So we're talking right on the eve of Pearl Harbor. Well, actually, even before that. But the FBI had been putting together this list of potentially dangerous enemy aliens. So you might think to yourself, what could make a person a potentially dangerous enemy alien? Well, I might think someone who was a known criminal or had been known to make statements about destroying this country, something like that. But the FBI had different qualifications. So this might be some of the things that could get you onto the FBI's watch list. So if you were a successful businessman, if you subscribed to Japanese newspapers or magazines, if you were in a group that was a mutual aid neighborhood association, so helping each other out, if you had ties to Japanese cultural activities, like you were a judo or kendo instructor, or you were a Japanese language instructor, if you practiced Shinto or you were a Buddhist priest, or if you were in a subversive organization like the Haiku Society. No Japanese poetry for you. So all of these things could get you on the FBI list. And what that meant was that those were the folks that got arrested as soon as Pearl Harbor happened. So in the afternoon of December 7th, some folks were arrested, and then basically they moved down the list. They had an ABC list. If you're on the A list, then you were the ones that they really had investigated and thought were dangerous. B list, you were potentially dangerous, or you hadn't been thoroughly investigated. And C was if you had pro-Japanese inclination. So those were the language teachers and that sort of thing. And these folks were the ones who were gathered up and sent to Fort Missoula. So Fort Missoula had been an Army base, and then it had been the site of the Civilian Conservation Corps' regional headquarters. So we had lots of infrastructure, but not a lot of importance in a military way. So we were given over to the Department of Justice to set up this detention center. And this was before Pearl Harbor. And the first folks that ended up here were the Italians, and some of you guys may know that story, but they were Italian folks who'd been on merchant vessels that were in American territorial waters, or they had been on working at the World's Fair. They were young men. We couldn't really guarantee their safe passage back to Italy. We probably wanted to take their boats for the Lend-Lease Act and help out England. And so we waited until their visas expired, and then they were arrested and sent to the Fort Missoula Alien Detention Center. That is a story for a whole another day, though. But the folks that we're focusing on today are the Japanese gentlemen who were sent to Fort Missoula. And we have some records from their detention hearings. Once they were sent here, they had to go through a loyalty hearing to prove that they were loyal. And then a group of folks were the ones that would give the recommendation to the FBI. Those people, let's see, I don't think, we'll come over here. Sorry, we're walking across the room. This is Mr. Matsushita, probably right after his loyalty hearing. And so he would be, Mr. Matsushita, for example, when he went to his loyalty hearing, he would have had, they tried to get like a district court judge and then 2 representatives of the FBI. And a lot of people ask about Mike Mansfield and his role in this. And it was thought that he was one of the people who was appointed by the FBI to be like a stand-in for these loyalty hearings if they didn't have someone from, say, Seattle, where Mr. Matsushita was. So the loyalty hearing, you were supposed to prove that you were loyal to the United States and you weren't dangerous. So the average age of our internees was about 60. And I'm going to pause a minute there because I keep using the word internment and internee, and that might be a little confusing to some folks who are more familiar with places like Heart Mountain and Manzanar and Minidoka. We say internment at Fort Missoula because it's a legal definition of what happened here. They were taken by the FBI and brought here because they were potentially dangerous enemy aliens. This is very different from what happened with Executive Order 9066. When we talk about places like Manzanar and Minidoka and Heart Mountain, the people that were there were just removed from the West Coast because they were ethnically Japanese, and it had nothing to do with any charges against them. So that's usually called incarceration or forced removal. Sometimes we'll hear euphemisms like internment to talk about that process as well, or sometimes you'll hear evacuation, but the preferred terminology is not internment when we're talking about those big camps. So, did I confuse you yet? Feel free to ask questions in the comments. Back to Fort Missoula for a moment. So I'm going to turn you around so you can see Mr. Matsushita. And I'm not going to go through everyone that we know and all the stories, because if you're a family member of mine, like my mom, I see my mom's there. Hi, Mom. You know that I could talk about internment endlessly. So, Mr. Matsushita. When you come to visit the museum, our whole back wall here has 3 stories that highlight 3 internees that we know a lot about that were at Fort Missoula. But today I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Mr. Matsushita because he had a big connection to Executive Order 9066. So, Mr. Matsushita and his wife are both from Japan, and they immigrated to the United States in 1919. He was kind of an academic guy. He was interested in studies, but he kind of worked his way up. He was a cook and then managed a boarding house, that sort of thing. But he was pretty well known for being sort of a teacher, and he was bilingual. He was also a Protestant and was raised Christian. And he and his wife really enjoyed the Pacific Northwest because it reminded them of Mount Rainier, reminded them of Mount Fuji. So looks like they went on some little picnics and stuff like that. So on December 7th, 1941, Mr. Matsushita opened the door to an FBI agent who arrested him, and he was detained at the Seattle's Immigration Center. One thing that put him on the list was his bilingualism, but then he was also a member of Japanese organizations they considered subversive, like the Haiku Society. And one of the great things that we have from Mr. Matsushita are letters that he wrote to his wife that sometimes include some of his poems as well. A very great resource if you want to know more about their family is this book, Imprisoned Apart. And it's a collection of letters written between Mr. Matsushita and Mrs. Matsushita. And it was a difficult time for them for sure. So going back to December 7th, 1941, that's when he's taken by the FBI. He ends up at Fort Missoula. He ended up being a waiter in the dining hall at Fort Missoula, and he taught classes here. And he was really interested in making the little stone pebble vases that some of you guys might know about. But all the while, he's getting letters from his friends that are worried about Mrs. Matsushita. So a couple months after he's sent to Fort Missoula, it is February 19th, same day as today. It's the anniversary of Executive Order 9066, and eventually his wife is sent to Minidoka, which is a war relocation authority camp in Idaho. And he's got some friends there that report on her mental state, and then we can read in Imprisoned Apart the exchanges of letters between them. So we know that while Mr. Matsushita was at Fort Missoula, his wife was in Idaho, and he desperately wanted to get back to be with her. So he went through his loyalty hearing, and it took 9 months for the result of that to come back. And they told him that he was to remain interned. They said that he was still potentially dangerous to public safety. Part of it had to do with the company that he'd worked for, and that he was part of the Japanese Chamber of Commerce. So he appealed the decision, and he gathered affidavits of support from white neighbors and people that he knew, and even Fort Missoula's superintendent was able to write a letter in support of him. But he was stuck at Fort Missoula, and he ended up not being able to reunite with his wife for 2 more years, and more than 2 years, and they were finally reunited on January 11th, 1944. And I'm sure that was at Minidoka, so he was let out of Fort Missoula and sent to one of the other camps. So knowing that more than, or around 120,000 people were sent to internment camps, confinement centers and internment camps, it's important to know that there's probably 120,000 stories, and they're going to be different. Some similarities to Mr. Matsushita, but there's just tons of stories. So we can't cover that all here at Fort Missoula. We do have some really great artifacts that we borrowed from the Oregon Historical Society about the Yasui Brothers store. There's a really great book about them called Stubborn Twig. And if you are familiar with Fort Missoula, you know that we've done some programs on the Yasui family. And then we also have a section here about Midori Shimoda, and we did a book talk about the book about his life as well recently. So there's more information there. The rest of the exhibit goes into detail about things that happened at these other camps that were established by Executive Order 9066. So they also had to do a loyalty questionnaire, and we had people joining for military service and also draft resistance. It's some really interesting stories there. And then, of course, as soon as internment or incarceration was over, it didn't mean that everything was okay again. A lot of times they couldn't go back to their own communities because people didn't trust them, even though their forced removal had nothing to do with any guilt. Actually, no Japanese or Japanese Americans were charged with espionage who were in these camps. And I'll have to double check, but I'm pretty sure I read on the JACL website that there was actually no Japanese Americans who were charged with treason or anything like that during World War II. So we had folks that had fought in the 442nd, which was the most decorated Army unit, and had fought very bravely during World War II, who then came back home and had to see things like this, where they had done service and then had to deal with this kind of vandalism at their homes, and stories of people who went in to get their hair cut, in their full uniform with all their medals, and were turned away because they were Japanese, even though they obviously were Americans. And obviously we're not going into great detail about the reasons behind the fear and the racism. Obviously, we were at war, and people had connections to losing people who had fought in Japan, and all the terrible things that happened to people who were captured in Japan. But what we're talking about here is Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals that lived in the United States and their treatment by the government during World War II. So, just moving kind of right to the end here. There was a bipartisan commission. There's a lot of different things that happened to get to this point, but in the 1980s, there was a bipartisan investigation that determined that Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity, and the decisions which followed from it, detention, and ending exclusion, were not driven by analysis of military conditions. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So that's what we're remembering today. We're remembering that executive order and the impact that it had on the Japanese American community, and that it continues to have on the Japanese American community. So, so much to talk about, so much to say, but I think it's important. I'm just showing you some organizations that that are Japanese American, that work on issues of civil liberties that are very important to them. If you want to know more in general about the big story, not just Fort Missoula, but all of the reasons for incarceration and what happened to people, there's a really great website called densho.org, which I'll link in the comments later. And they have a section called Core Story that will help you figure out how we got to the point where we imprisoned 120,000 people. Yeah, I think I'll probably wrap it up there, because otherwise I'll have you forever on here. Susan says thanks. She was with me this morning and she's listening to it again. But if you would like to have a tour of this exhibit, or if you just want to come visit it on your own, I'm happy to arrange for that. You just have to send me a message on Facebook or through our website, and we can get that organized. Always more to learn, so let me know if you have any questions or anything I said was confusing, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.